As a child, my life was shadowed by the ominous presence of the house where I grew up. It was a sprawling 6-bedroom relic, filled to the brim with family, my grandparents, my brother, 2 cousins, 3 uncles, and 4 aunts. Despite the noise and warmth of so many souls under one roof, the house carried an energy that refused to be ignored. This energy was alive, lurking in the corners, whispering in the hallways, and mocking those brave enough to challenge it. My grandparents, Henry and Margaret, were the unyielding anchors of the household. Henry, with his stern demeanor and cruel tendencies, seemed to thrive in the shadows. Margaret, on the other hand, exuded a calm presence, her soft voice often the only thing that kept the house's tension at bay. But even she couldn't deny the spirits that seemed to cling to us or the walls themselves. The spirits were omnipresent, their intentions not inherently malevolent but unnerving all the same. The most notorious among them was a little girl in a white dress, always accompanied by a small white dog. She'd linger in the hallway near the front of the house, her gaze piercing yet empty. The others in the house, family and visitors alike, would often catch fleeting glimpses of her, a figure lost in time yet impossibly aware of our world. She wasn't alone, many spirits wandered freely. Some were thought to be friends of my aunts, whose long stays at the house brought with them attachments from the afterlife. Despite these otherworldly intrusions, the upstairs portion of the house felt relatively benign. The basement, however, was a different story entirely. Dark and unfinished, it held an air of dread that seemed to intensify the further one ventured in. The laundry room, a small, poorly lit area, was particularly oppressive. A laundry chute connected the upstairs to this room, allowing the clothes to tumble down to their final resting place in a wicker basket. It was a clever setup, except for one glaring flaw: no one wanted to retrieve the clothes from below. The very act of descending those stairs felt like an invitation to something unseen, something waiting. I vividly remember the rule among us kids: you never walked back up those basement stairs, you ran. The sensation of being followed was undeniable, as if icy fingers were reaching out, just missing your ankle as you bolted to safety. My grandparents' solution was pragmatic yet chilling: the oldest child, often the most defiant, would be offered the basement as their bedroom. A rite of passage, perhaps, or a punishment disguised as privilege. Few accepted the offer, choosing instead to cram into shared rooms upstairs. Encounters with the spirits were routine, almost mundane in their frequency. I recall one evening when I saw Henry, or what I thought was Henry, heading into his bedroom on the far side of the house. I followed him, needing to ask a question, only to find the room empty. When I asked Margaret, she casually informed me he was in his office, in the basement, working on the bills. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever I had seen wasn't Henry. Henry, the abusive patriarch, seemed impervious to the house's darker energies. In hindsight, I've come to believe it wasn't because he was unaware of them but because he thrived on their presence. Perhaps the malevolence that lurked in the basement found a kindred spirit in him. The basement's darkness never fazed him, it seemed to welcome him. He was the only one who could spend hours down there without so much as a shiver. For the rest of us, the mimicry was unsettling. Shadows played tricks on our eyes, but sometimes it wasn't shadows. We'd see family members, aunt, uncle, cousin, walking into a room or standing in a hallway, only to find them elsewhere in the house. These apparitions never felt evil, yet their playful nature carried a sinister undertone. Were they merely spirits enjoying their own games, or something darker, testing our perceptions and boundaries? I've heard of flesh pedestrians and mimics in recent years, entities that feed on deception. If that's what we encountered, why did they feel so familiar? So intimate? The basement seemed to develop its own sentience over time, a brooding entity that thrived on fear. It wasn't just the oppressive darkness or the cold, damp air that clung to your skin. No, it was the silence, a silence so complete that even the sound of your own heartbeat felt like an intrusion. It wasn't uncommon to hear faint whispers, just barely audible over the hum of the water heater. Sometimes, it sounded like my name, but when I'd call out, there'd be nothing but the echo of my voice bouncing off the cinderblock walls. Henry spent most of his nights down there. I'd hear his heavy footsteps creak along the old wooden stairs, a sound that became synonymous with dread. The office he worked in was no more than a glorified corner of the basement with a desk and a single dim lamp. Yet, he claimed it was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of the house. I never understood how he could be so at ease in that space, where the air itself felt like it was conspiring against you. I remember the night I dared to confront the basement's terror head-on. My curiosity outweighed my fear, or perhaps it was a darker part of me, relishing the thrill of the unknown. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a scream in the quiet. The beam of light illuminated the cold concrete floor, the stacks of boxes filled with forgotten relics, and the laundry basket that always seemed impossibly far from the stairs. As I moved deeper, the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. Then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness. It didn't move like a person, it slithered, its form shifting and stretching as though it were trying to decide what it wanted to be. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen, my flashlight flickering as if the shadow was feeding on its light. A low chuckle broke the silence, a sound that seemed to reverberate from the walls themselves. It wasn't Henry's voice, it wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. My heart raced as I turned and bolted up the stairs, the shadow's presence chasing me, though I dared not look back. By the time I reached the top, I was gasping for air, my legs trembling. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, as if the flimsy barrier could hold back whatever was down there. I never told anyone about that night. Henry wouldn't have cared, and Margaret would have brushed it off as my imagination. But the basement's pull grew stronger after that. It was as if it knew I'd seen it, and it wanted me to come back. The shadows in the corners of the house seemed darker, and the faint whispers grew louder, more insistent. I started waking up in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched so intense that I'd break out in a cold sweat. My room, once a haven, became a prison, its walls closing in as the house's energies seeped through. One of my uncles, David, decided to move his bedroom to the basement after a particularly heated argument with Henry. He was stubborn and reckless, traits that had earned him both admiration and scorn in equal measure. David dismissed our warnings about the basement, laughing off our stories as childish fears. For the first few nights, he seemed unfazed, even mocking us for our reluctance to go down there. But David's bravado didn't last. He began to change, his once lively demeanor replaced by a quiet, brooding intensity. He stopped joining us for meals, instead opting to eat alone in his room. When he did speak, his words were clipped, his tone filled with an edge that hadn't been there before. It was as if the basement was draining him, piece by piece, reshaping him into something unrecognizable. One night, I heard him screaming. It was a guttural, primal sound that echoed through the house, waking everyone. We found him at the top of the basement stairs, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He refused to tell us what had happened, but he never set foot in the basement again. Whatever he'd seen or experienced down there, it had broken something inside him. After David's ordeal, the basement was sealed off. Henry begrudgingly agreed, though he still spent time down there when he thought no one was paying attention. The rest of us avoided it entirely, treating it like a wound that refused to heal. But the house's energy remained, its whispers and shadows a constant reminder that it was alive, watching, waiting. Over time, the house became less a home and more a cage, its unseen inhabitants growing bolder with each passing year. The little girl in the white dress, once a harmless curiosity, began appearing more frequently, her dog's bark echoing faintly through the halls at odd hours. She seemed to watch me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I started to feel like her fascination wasn't mere curiosity but something deeper, something darker. The whispers, too, grew louder, evolving into fragmented words and sentences. They spoke in tones that hinted at malice, their voices overlapping in a dissonant symphony of dread. Some nights, I'd press my ear against the walls, straining to make out the words. I never could. It was as if the house was speaking a language meant to drive me mad. Margaret began to notice the toll the house was taking on me. Though she was a woman of simple faith, with her rosary always within arm's reach, even she seemed at a loss for how to combat the darkness creeping into our lives. She'd sprinkle holy water in the rooms and recite prayers, her voice trembling as she implored whatever was in the house to leave us in peace. But it didn't work. If anything, it seemed to agitate whatever forces were at play. Henry, of course, remained indifferent. His presence only seemed to embolden the shadows, as if they fed off his cruelty. He'd mock Margaret's efforts, calling her rituals pointless theatrics. Yet, I couldn't help but notice that even he avoided certain parts of the house. There were rooms he'd glance at warily, his scorn giving way to an unspoken unease. The breaking point came one summer night, when the air was thick with heat and tension. I woke to the sound of something crashing in the kitchen. My heart raced as I crept out of bed, clutching a baseball bat I'd kept hidden for such moments. As I reached the doorway, I saw the little girl standing by the fridge. But this time, she wasn't alone. A tall, shadowy figure loomed behind her, its form barely discernible but undeniably menacing. Its presence was suffocating, a void that seemed to draw all the light out of the room. The girl turned to me, her expression blank but her eyes were filled with a cold, unyielding hatred. She pointed at me, and the shadow began to move. I stumbled back, dropping the bat as I scrambled to my room. Slamming the door shut, I pressed my back against it, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers started again, louder this time, their words still indecipherable but their intent clear. They were coming for me. That night, I didn't sleep. By morning, I was resolved to leave the house. Margaret tried to convince me otherwise, her eyes filled with tears as she begged me to stay. But I couldn't. Whatever was in that house had taken too much from me already. I packed my belongings and left, vowing never to return. Years later, I heard that the house had been abandoned. Henry had passed away, and Margaret had moved in with one of my aunts. The last time I drove by, the house stood in disrepair, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown. Yet, even from the street, I could feel its pull, a darkness that hadn't lessened with time. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that house. I see the little girl and her shadowy companion, their forms flickering in and out of view. And when I wake, I swear I can still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, calling me back to the place I swore I'd never go again. As the years passed, I tried to bury the memories of that house and the darkness that lingered within its walls. But some things refused to stay buried. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of faint whispers echoing in my ears. The dreams became more vivid, more relentless. The little girl with her cold, unyielding stare and the shadow that followed her became fixtures in my nightmares. They were no longer content to remain confined to the house, they had followed me, etched into the recesses of my mind. I moved far away, to a place where the air felt clean and the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. But no matter how far I ran, the shadows of my past clung to me. I avoided mirrors at night, unable to shake the feeling that if I looked too long, I'd see something staring back. I stopped keeping clocks in my room, as their ticking reminded me too much of the house's oppressive silence. Margaret tried to keep in touch, sending letters and occasional phone calls. She'd tell me about her new life with my aunt, how she was adjusting to the change. But there was always an undercurrent of sadness in her voice, a weight that seemed to follow her despite the distance from that cursed place. She never spoke about Henry or the house unless I brought it up, and even then, her answers were curt, evasive. One day, I received a package from Margaret. Inside was a small box, its contents wrapped in a piece of worn cloth. When I unfolded it, I found the old rosary she had always carried. There was no note, just the rosary, its beads smooth from years of prayer. I knew what it meant. She was gone. Attending her funeral was the first time I'd been back in that part of the country since leaving the house. The sight of her frail body lying in the casket brought a wave of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Guilt, sorrow, and an inexplicable sense of dread. After the service, my aunt pulled me aside, her face pale and her hands trembling. She talked about you in her last days, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She said you had to be careful. That it wasn't over. The words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to dismiss them, chalking it up to the ramblings of an old woman, but deep down, I knew better. The house's reach was long, and its grip on us was unrelenting. As I drove away from the funeral, I felt an overwhelming urge to see the house one last time. I knew it was a terrible idea, but something, whether it was curiosity, defiance, or a darker compulsion, drove me to return. The drive was eerily familiar, each twist and turn of the road stirring memories I'd tried to suppress. When I finally arrived, the sight of the house took my breath away. It looked worse than I'd imagined. The once pristine yard was overgrown with weeds, the paint on the house peeled and faded. The windows, boarded up long ago, gave it a lifeless, hollow appearance. Yet, as I stood there, I felt it watching me, the same oppressive energy pressing down on me as it had all those years ago. I don't know what possessed me to step out of the car. My legs felt heavy, as if the very ground was trying to anchor me in place. I approached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open with little resistance, revealing the dim interior. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The whispers started almost immediately. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I ventured further inside, they grew louder, more distinct. They spoke my name, over and over, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw her. The little girl in the white dress stood at the end of the hallway, her dog by her side. But this time, there was no shadowy figure behind her. She took a step toward me, and the dog growled low in its throat. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to move. "Why did you leave us?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an edge that sent chills down my spine. "You were supposed to stay." The walls began to close in, the hallway stretching impossibly long. The whispers turned into screams, and the air grew colder with each passing second. I could feel the house's anger, its hunger, wrapping around me like a vice. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I drove away as fast as I could, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon. That was the last time I ever went back. The dreams haven't stopped, and the whispers still haunt me in the quiet moments of the night. But I've made peace with one thing: the house will always be a part of me, a shadow that I can't escape. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what it wanted.